Would you believe that the entire human race, all of us, once shrank down to an incredibly small group, small enough to fit inside one quiet neighborhood? I'm serious. There's a stretch of time, deep in our past, where you could have counted every single human alive on the whole planet and barely filled a few streets. And here's the wild part. The only reason we know is hiding somewhere you'd never think to look. Not in the ground, not in old bones. I already did the digging, so let me tell you the story. Look around you. Right now, there are more than 8 billion people alive on this planet. You push past strangers on the street. You sit in traffic, boxed in by people sealed inside their own little metal worlds. You scroll past faces in cities you'll never visit. You order food from a screen and it shows up at your door, carried by someone whose name you'll never learn. Humans are everywhere. We're so many and so incredibly spread out that being truly alone, no other person for 100 miles is something almost no one alive has ever felt. We dominate this planet so completely that we barely even notice it anymore. But there was a moment when almost every one of us was gone, when the entire human race could have fit inside one quiet neighborhood, a few streets, a handful of cold, frightened people carrying every story our species would ever tell. And they didn't stay that way for a year, not a lifetime, not one generation. They stayed that way for more than 100,000 years. So how did our ancestors come within a hair of vanishing forever? And here's the stranger question. How could we possibly know it ever happened? The evidence didn't come from bones. It came from you. In 2023, a team led by Wang Jihu published a study in the journal Science. They'd built a new tool called FitCol, and incredibly, it could do something that sounds impossible. It could read the deep history of an entire population, going back hundreds of thousands of years, just from the DNA of people alive today. No fossils, no skeletons, just the living. And the idea is incredibly simple. Every piece of DNA inside you was handed down by your ancestors, copied across thousands of generations. Trace those genes back far enough, and they start to merge, folding into older and older versions of themselves, until they meet in a shared ancestor. The shape of that merging holds a secret. A big, healthy population leaves a completely different fingerprint than a tiny, struggling one. So, if you know how to look, the living can tell you about the dead. They fed it the genomes of 3,154 people, 10 populations from Africa, 40 from the rest of the world. And what came back? Nobody saw coming. Here's the strange thing about us. All 8 billion of us are almost genetically identical. We look different. Sure, faces, skin, eyes, but underneath, our DNA is incredibly similar. So similar that 2 groups of chimpanzees on opposite banks of a single river can carry more genetic difference between them than 2 humans on opposite sides of the entire planet. Think about that for a second. A species as old as ours, spread this far, should be bursting with variety. Surprisingly, we're not. Incredibly, our genes look thin, clipped, like a huge part of the family tree got sawed off long ago, and only a few branches were left to grow the whole thing back. Our genes, in other words, look like the genes of survivors. So just how few survivors are we talking about? According to that 2023 study, the answer is brutal. The breeding population of our ancestors may have crashed all the way down to an incredibly small number, around 1,280 individuals. From nearly 100,000 down to 1,280. One honest note on that number. That's the breeding population, the people actually passing their genes down to us. The real headcount was probably a few thousand, but still, barely a few thousand people. That's not a country, not a city, not even a small town. That's the entire human family, not in one valley, in the entire world. Picture it. A small neighborhood, a couple of quiet streets. Now imagine that's the only place on Earth where human beings exist. Step outside it, any direction, and you'll walk for thousands of kilometers and find nothing. No village, no campfires, no smoke on the horizon. Just empty land and grass and wind and the silence of a planet that has almost completely forgotten we were ever here. Picture it one more way. An incredibly small crowd, every human being alive on Earth, and you could fit them all inside a single school auditorium with empty seats to spare. Fewer people than show up to a local amateur football match. Barely enough to fill 2 subway cars. And the researchers believe this wiped out close to 99% of our ancestors. But here's the part that's almost unbearable. It didn't happen fast. Not one bad winter. Not a single disaster that came and went. This bottleneck lasted around 117,000 years. It began roughly 930,000 years ago, and it didn't end until around 813,000 years ago. That's an incredibly long time. Longer than our own species, Homo sapiens has even existed. Generation after generation, born into a world that was barely holding on and never knowing anything else. Born few, living few, dying few for longer than we can really imagine. Researchers sometimes just call it the 0.9 million year bottleneck. A quiet, clinical little name for the closest our family ever came to ending. So what could do that to us? What could press an entire species down to almost nothing and hold it there for 100,000 years? The leading suspect is the planet itself. Around this same time, Earth was passing through something geologists call the early to middle Pleistocene transition. For ages, the ice ages had come and gone in a steady rhythm, a cycle of about 41,000 years. Cold, then warm. Hard, but survivable. Something our ancestors had learned to live through. Then that rhythm completely broke. The cycle slowed down and grew teeth. Now the cold came. And it stayed sometimes for almost 100,000 years at a stretch. Extremely long, extremely cold. Imagine a winter that doesn't break for your entire life. Then your child's entire life. Then theirs, and theirs after that. The ice sheets thickened. The winters grew meaner. In Africa, the forests that had fed our ancestors for countless generations dried out and pulled back, replaced by open, hungry grassland. And then something incredibly eerie shows up in the record. The fossils almost stop. Across Africa and Eurasia, for this whole stretch, the bones go nearly silent. Almost no skeletons. Almost no stone tools. A few incredibly rare scraps survive: a piece of a skull at Bori in Ethiopia, a handful of fragments at Tayenif in Algeria, and that's very nearly all of it. Like someone reached out and turned the whole world down to a whisper. And that silence isn't just missing evidence. To a lot of scientists, the silence is the evidence. It's exactly what you'd expect if there were barely any people left to leave anything behind. You can even read it in the teeth of the animals, chemical signatures locked in the enamel, showing whole herds forced off their old food as the land dried out. Now picture what holding on actually looked like. A mother keeping a child warm through a night so cold, their breath freezes on their lips. A small group huddled together, quietly counting the ones who didn't wake up that morning. No medicina, no safety net. When your whole world is a few hundred people, there's no margin for a bad year. And they had hundreds of bad years, back to back. You can almost hear it, the wind, the dark, and someone deciding to hold on for just one more day. And not all of them made it. Around 1 million years ago, a kind of human called Homo antecessor was living in Europe. They made tools. They hunted. Then, somewhere inside this same brutal window, they simply vanish. A whole branch of the human story. Gone. The ones who did survive, the group whose genes are still inside you right now, the researchers argue were an early form of Homo heidelbergensis, the line that would one day give rise to the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and eventually us. The entire rest of the human story, hanging from one incredibly thin root. We may even have found one of their last footholds. At Prezelitis, in what's now the Czech Republic, archaeologists found a ring of stones about 700,000 years old, possibly one of the oldest shelters humans ever built. Stone laid on stone by hand, against a sky that seemed to want them dead. But there's one more piece to this, and almost nobody talks about it. Fire. We've got evidence humans had been using fire for nearly 1 million years. We knew it. We had it. And yet, during the very worst of this cold, the fire seems to just go missing. Archaeologists find almost no hearths from this period, almost no charred bones. It's like our ancestors had touched fire but hadn't truly learned to keep it, to carry it, to lean on it, through a winter that would not end. And think about how fragile that is. One storm, one wet night, and the flame is gone, and the warmth is gone, and the one edge keeping you alive is gone with it. And the researchers argue this may be exactly when everything turned. That when our ancestors finally mastered fire for good, when they learned to carry a living flame from one camp to the next without letting it die, that's when the population, incredibly slowly, began to climb back. One piece of technology, reaching down into the dark, pulling an entire species back up from the edge of the grave. And we weren't the only ones disappearing. This same window lines up with a wave of extinctions right across the planet. Saber-toothed cats like Meganterion fade out. Ancient hunting dogs like Xenocyon vanish too. One by one, the big predators stop showing up in the fossil record. And down in the oceans, whole families of microscopic life, the tiny creatures at the base of the entire food chain, die off completely in the very same stretch. During a brutal, extremely cold snap, the Ice Age record calls Marine Isotope Stage 22. Whatever was happening to our ancestors, it wasn't only happening to us, it was happening to the world. So by now, you might be feeling it. That cold weight in the chest, those few hundred people, alone at the edge of everything, while the rest of the planet went quiet around them. But here's where the whole story turns. Because we have to ask the uncomfortable question, how sure are we that any of this is actually true? And honestly, a lot less sure than you'd think. Since that 2023 study came out, other teams of geneticists have looked at the exact same DNA and landed somewhere extremely skeptical. Surprisingly, when researchers Trevor Cousins and Arun Durvasula ran it through different methods in 2025, they couldn't reproduce the bottleneck at all. And incredibly, a model with no near extinction fit the data better than the one with it. Another team, Deng, Nielsen, and Song, went further, arguing the whole thing is likely a statistical artifact, a ghost in the math, not something that ever happened to living, breathing people. And they caught something strange. The dramatic crash showed up clearly in the DNA of people from Africa, but it barely appeared in people from outside Africa. That's a problem. Those two groups split apart far more recently than 900,000 years ago, so if our whole species had nearly died out back then, that scar should be sitting in everyone's DNA, all over the world. Now, the original team has pushed back hard, insisting the signal really is there in both. The fight is still going, right now, as you watch this. And maybe you've been wondering something this whole time. How does a group that small, scattered across a frozen continent, even find each other to have children without collapsing into inbreeding? Here's the twist inside the twist. Maybe they never lived as one tiny group at all. Maybe our ancestors were never almost wiped out. Maybe they were just broken into small, scattered, isolated bands, drifting together and apart across the land, and a fragmented population like that leaves the exact same fingerprint as a bottleneck without anyone ever coming incredibly close to extinction. Same math. A completely different story. One is a near death. The other is just how scattered populations sometimes look, looking back. So the most haunting story in all of human prehistory is still being written, right now, in real time. And yet, whatever the final answer turns out to be, one thing barely changes. Our genes are still carrying a strange thinness, an incredibly faint signature of having once been very, very few a very, very long time ago. Even the skeptics agree the genome remembers something unusual about our past, something we have almost no other way to see. So come back to now. Today, there are 8 billion of us. We've filled every continent, crossed every ocean, built cities so bright they glow when you look down at the Earth from space. We've conquered this planet so completely that we've forgotten the one thing that should still frighten us, that we were ever a species that could just blink out, like a candle, and leave the world dark and empty of us. And here's the quiet truth underneath it all. Genetically, we're still almost the same person. The same incredibly small handful of survivors, copied over and over and over, 8 billion times. The crowd is incredibly large. But the source of the crowd is barely anything at all. Somewhere in your cells, in code you'll never see, you're carrying the same quiet instructions that kept those few hundred people alive through the cold. In a very real, very physical way, you're still one of them. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. Every single one of your ancestors, without one exception, survived long enough to have a child. An unbroken chain, stretching back through that freezing bottleneck and back a million years before it. Break one link, one ancestor who froze, or starved, or simply never found anyone, and you are not here. You are not reading this. You never existed at all. We only get to tell this story because we are the ones who made it. Every human who didn't left no one behind to wonder about them. We gained the entire world. What we lost is harder to name. Maybe what we lost is the memory that we were ever fragile at all. And honestly, that's the part that stays with me, not how close we came, but how completely we forgot it. So look around you again. 8 billion faces. A crowd so vast it feels eternal, permanent, like it could never have been any other way. But it could have. Ironically, every one of those faces is the descendant of a tiny band of survivors who once huddled at the edge of a freezing world 900,000 years ago in what may have been almost the last place on Earth that human beings still existed. We are not the children of the strong. We are the children of the few who barely made it. A crowd of 8 billion isn't proof that we were always many. Ironically, it's the echo of a fire that very nearly went out. So, before you go Team Fitcole, who says we really did almost end? Or Team Statistical Ghost, who says it never happened at all? Tell me where you land. I really want to know.